have heard that supposedly old Chinese curse, "May you live in interesting times." I've been thinking about that recently because these are interesting times. And throughout my life, there have been times of what I might think of as existential crisis. Times when it seemed like the world that I knew and appeared to understand was about to change, was in threat, and those changes were not for the better. One of my earliest memories back in the 50s was going with my parents to the Tennessee State Fair and visiting a model of a fallout shelter, because we were sure that eventually the Russians were going to aim their missiles at us. And I remember my mother collecting canned goods and bottled water, and us making plans as to where we would go and if there was an attack. And I remember also at school being told to duck and cover under my desk, a wholly ineffectual way of dealing with a nuclear attack. And I vividly recall as a 12-year-old the anxiety of my elders when the Cuban Missile Crisis came in 1962. You can do the math. We were sure that the world was about to end. But that crisis in the early 60s was only a prelude to the crisis of the following decade that we had to endure, and I personally had to endure as a child of the 60s. Because the Vietnam War seemed to set loose a kind of madness in the world as well as in the United States. Protests and revolutions and riots raged around the world and in our cities. My older contemporaries were drafted and sent to the war, and some of them did not come home. And I would graduate in 1968, which was the year that it seemed that everything was going to come unraveled. Not only was there war and conflict around the globe, but there was a contentious presidential election. Imagine that. And I had only just arrived in Chicago in August of 1968 to go to school just in time for the infamous Democratic National Convention, where the older Mayor Daley said, "The police are not here to create disorder. The police are here to preserve disorder." The times were terrible, but the music was good. And there have been many more of those times of what appeared, at least to me, to be existential crisis, greater or lesser import. In the 1970s, you had the oil embargo, you had inflation. Some of you will remember the WIN buttons, whip inflation now. We had the slow motion collapse of communism in Europe in the 80s and the 90s that utterly changed the world and in some ways made it much more dangerous. And finally, we had a series of wars and conflicts in the Middle East, culminating and issuing out of the 9/11 attacks. The reverberation of those attacks lasts up until this day, particularly as we think of the war between Israel and Hamas and all the fear and grief that that's occasioning. But those wars and conflicts and attendant miseries are only a part of the current existential crisis. Over the last 5 years, we have experienced a global pandemic that shut down the world and brought about economic and political and social chaos. In the United States, we went through a contentious election in 2020 and were shocked when our Capitol building was sacked and our legislators fled for their lives. And now we're facing another contentious, perhaps even more contentious election. And whatever your politics, fear seems to be the word of the day. Fear that if the other side gets in, it'll be the end of our country. Facing such a crisis, what does it mean to be a Christian? How are we, followers of Jesus, to live in the face of such contentiousness and dread? How do we live in times like these? Ephesians is one of the prison epistles. Paul was in prison. He says he's a prisoner of the Lord. We're not quite sure where he was in prison. It could have been in Rome, could have been in Ephesus, could have been in Caesarea. These are the kind of things that scholars like to argue about. But whatever his situation, being a prisoner in the ancient world and the Roman world put you at risk. And if Paul was indeed in prison in Rome, the outcome of his trial was going to be that he would be beheaded. And Paul knew that if he was at risk, that they, his churches, people like the church in Ephesus and the church in Philippi and elsewhere, they were also going to be at risk. It was disconcerting. And what does Paul expect from them, and for that matter, from us? Live out your calling, he tells them. And their calling, as I've argued for the last 2 weeks, was to an intimate walk with Jesus. In another of his prison epistles of Philippians, he would call this to have the mind of Christ. And that walk, that disposition calls, in this passage we heard this morning, for several key virtues. Profound humility, gentleness, patience, and the ability to put up with others in love. Now, if everything is going well in your community, you don't particularly need these virtues. You don't need patience unless somebody is trying it. You don't need to put up with people unless some people are difficult to put up with. No, you need these virtues when there are angry, arrogant, hateful people attacking you or attacking those you love, trying your patience, making you wish they'd go elsewhere. Paul refers to these virtues frequently in his letters, and I would suggest that he refers to them not because Paul himself was so humble and gentle and patient. In fact, it's pretty clear that he was not. My old teacher in graduate school used to say that Paul had a rather robust ego. He said about Paul that even if he was going to acknowledge that he was a sinner, he had to be the worst one. And Paul had a temper. You can see it in his letters, especially in Galatians, where he loses his cool with the Galatians on more than one occasion. One of the translations has Paul saying, "Oh, you dear idiots of Galatia." I don't think he meant it that nicely. So he recommends these virtues, I suspect, not because they were so characteristic of him, but because he had so much trouble with them. And he saw the harm that lacking these virtues had in his churches and in his ministry. And then Paul had the example of Jesus before him. It's my observation that as a whole, facing these existential crises, that we're not doing all that well as the Church of Jesus Christ. I observed to my wife Dawn last week that it was a good thing that the Apostle Paul didn't have a Facebook account. To say that the posts from Christians that I see, well, are not exactly humble, gentle, and patient. I've often said that there's a thin line between being a prophet and being a jerk. And a fair number of people who think they are being prophetic these days are just being cruel and angry and paranoid and offensive. They're being jerks. I suggested a couple of weeks ago that one of the things we are as the Church of Jesus Christ is a community committed to learning. And within that, a school of charity. Over the next few months, I would encourage all of us to practice humility and gentleness and patience and putting up with each other in love. In the church, we are set down among sisters and brothers with whom we do not necessarily agree, and with whom we do not necessarily get along to learn these things. Henry Nouwen said once that the thing that you can guarantee about a community is that the person you get along with the least will move in next door. And yet, we are called into this community to learn these virtues with each other so that we can demonstrate them more widely in our fractured world. Now, we need a virtue of humility because we don't know everything. We speak of God, we preachers, we priests, with these fragile things we call words. With our small minds and imaginations and experience, we speak of the high and holy one. The best thing that we ever say about God is always going to be partially wrong. And that's the same thing is true of each other. If you and I have a common experience, and I say, I know how you feel, we both know that's not true because I'm not you. And if it's hard for us to understand what each other is going through, it's that much more difficult to understand the mind of God. So we need humility. And we need the virtue of gentleness, because people are afraid and confused. You don't yell at a child who's afraid of the dark. You comfort them and assure them that they are safe and loved. And we need patience, because learning to love each other takes time. Learning to endure uncertainty takes time. Learning to live with differences takes time. And we need to bear with one another in love, because we ourselves can be a bit much sometimes. And I include myself among that group. And we learn to bear with each other in love, because thank God, the high and holy one bears with us in love. This is what the wider world, Christian and otherwise, needs from all of us this time. Not snippiness and moral outrage, not snide remarks and cruel caricatures, not harsh attacks and blatant falsehood, but humility, gentleness, patience, and love. And these days such virtues are counterintuitive. Such virtues are even radical. Back in Paul's letter to the Galatians, after venting his spleen on his enemies, Paul dialed it back a little bit. He told them the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. But the acts of the sinful nature, he says, were hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, factions, and envy. That last part virtually describes our political process. But we have been called in our homes, in our churches, in our workplaces, in our public squares, in our public life to something else entirely. Let's show one another and the rest of society what it means to trust and hope in God, even in the face of fearful crisis. Thanks be to God.